afternoon. My name is Nicole Chung, and I'm with the Washington Post, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. First, a word of thanks to our co-chairman of the festival, David Rubenstein, and the other generous sponsors who've made this event possible. If you'd like to add your financial support, please note the information in your program. We'll have some time after this presentation for your questions, and I've been asked to remind you that if you come to the microphone, you will be included in the videotape of this event, which may be broadcast at a later date. Our guest this afternoon is Brendan Kiely, who is an amazing young adult author about books all about love in different shapes and forms. His most recent book is Tradition, and before that, he was the co-author of All American Boys with Jason Reynolds. In addition, he also wrote The Last True Love Story. And without further ado, please welcome Brendan Kiely to the stage.
How's it going? All right. I can't see you at all, so if I can hear you, it just makes me feel like I'm not alone in the room, so I appreciate that. Thanks, everyone. It is such an honor to be invited to speak at the National Book Festival. I think a lot about how sometimes we read articles and they're threatening, books are dying, publishing is dying, people aren't reading. And then you read other articles and you, I think, have to look to young folks, as we often do, to think about how there's so much passion for so much literature right now, especially as we think about a publishing industry that is ever so slowly thinking about how to broaden the scope of the kinds of stories that we hear, the kinds of stories that we publish, and the kinds of stories that have always existed out there and just needed to be published to a wider audience. And so for me to say all this in context of being part of the National Book Festival, I think is really important, that we think about what it means to be writing books for the entire nation and to be thinking about what it means to be part of that tradition as opposed to some other traditions that I will get into in a moment. But before I talk about tradition, I want to just give you a little bit of context about Brendan Kiely and who I am and sort of where I come from and how I became a writer. And to do that, I want to take you back to my very first book, which was called The Gospel of Winter. I'm from the Boston area, and I grew up in an Irish Catholic community, household, big family, went to Catholic schools, and I was dismayed when the Boston Globe broke the news story on January 6th of 2002 about the scandal of abuse in the Catholic Church, the vast cover-up of scandal of abuse in the Catholic Church. I watched at dinner table conversations as family members would go to war with each other, some people saying, this is now a time to double down and show our faith. Other people saying, now is the time where I say goodbye to this church and I never return ever again. And to see families at war with each other in that way made me think a lot about what it means to be a young person watching their families at war in this way, or watching their communities at war in this way. And what does it mean to be a young person who's trying to navigate all of that struggle and that strife? And it was really important to me, especially because of all of that particular connection that I had to that news story. So when I wrote my book, The Gospel of Winter, which is about a 16-year-old boy who's struggling to decide whether or not he should tell the world he's been abused by his priest, I was really nervous, as you can imagine. I was especially nervous what my family would say, right? Brendan, you shouldn't be talking about that stuff. Instead, I felt like I had to. But I did one wise thing while working on this book. I gave an early copy to my grandmother, the matriarch of the family, Grandma Kiely. We call her Saint Jane in the family, and she is Saint Jane in so many ways. And I was nervous. What is Grandma going to think of this book? She wrote back to me after she'd read the early advance copy of the book, and she wrote this note to me, by the way, on Facebook, Cyber Grandma. It was pretty remarkable to receive her note, because she said, Brendan, this book reminds me of Solomon asking God for a listening heart. And I think about that line, and I will probably choke up halfway through saying this now. I think about that line, about what it means to have a listening heart. And I realized that Grandma was, as always, so much wiser than I will ever be. And she put to words what I realized was my mission in writing books for young folks, writing books for adults, writing books for anyone who wants to think about how do we voice the emotional experience of living in communities that feel like they're at war with each other in so many ways. Maybe what we need is to find these listening hearts. And so I try to write books with a listening heart, and I try to write books about people who are discovering what it means to look for and find and to embrace their own listening hearts. And so the second book that I wrote is called The Last True Love Story. And of course, who did I want to write this book for? My grandmother. Because it was a story about, in short, it's a story about a family that's grappling with a grandfather who has Alzheimer's disease. And I wrote that book because my grandmother was there as a rock as my grandfather was passing away from Alzheimer's disease. And The Last True Love Story is about two teens who spring an Alzheimer's-afflicted grandfather from an assisted living facility in Los Angeles and take him on a cross-country road trip to Ithaca, New York, to the hill where he first kissed his wife, so that he can try to hold on to the memories of her before the disease takes them all away. And meanwhile, the two teens are falling in love for the first time. Because my grandmother was 19 years old when she married my grandfather. And I think about that fact because I think about, regardless of how we feel about those laws or those customs or those traditions or whatever it might be, I think about the capacity of young folks to fall in love. That's a real thing that I want to honor. There are some of you in this room who might be teens who are falling in love. Awesome! I'm excited for you. It's a great feeling. And as my grandfather told me one night when I was interviewing him, as he was passing away from Alzheimer's disease, I was trying to get his stories of the sort of hard-scrabble Irish immigrant stories in Western Massachusetts. I really wanted to write a historical novel, you see. But that's not what he wanted to talk about. All he wanted to talk about every night as I interviewed him is his mind wandered around and he lost his place in his storytelling. All he wanted to talk about was my grandmother and how they fell in love. He'd get lost in his stories and he'd reach over and he'd hold my arm and he'd say, "Brendan, this is why I love your grandmother. This is why I love your grandmother. She was the rock." And so I thought about, well, I have to write this story about what it means to try to talk about love near the end of life, and how maybe the one thing you want to talk about are those moments when you first learned how to fall in love, those moments when you first learned what it meant to open your heart up to somebody else and to have them open their heart up to you. And so The Last True Love Story is that dual narrative of trying to hold on to love at the end of life and what it means to be falling in love for the first time and traveling across the country. But love, I really appreciate your introduction so much, because so often people want to say, Brendan writes about social justice. And yes, I do, and I care about that, but I think at the heart of social justice is love. And so I so appreciate that introduction, because as I begin to talk about these next two books, I want folks to understand that the place I'm speaking from is a place of love. Because the next book that I wrote, though it was published before The Last True Love Story, I co-wrote with Jason Reynolds, and it's called All American Boys. And I'm stoked to be a part of that book and that project. Because as I was a high school teacher in New York City, and I was looking around at trying to think about how do I engage my classroom in a more race-conscious fashion, how do I adjust my curriculum to begin to think about being race-conscious as opposed to that distorted disease of colorblindness, I was looking around for texts that would talk about white privilege and what it meant for a teen who's white, like me, to begin to process what that privilege means. And I was having a hard time, actually, finding a novel about that. And as Jason and I we were friends at the time already before we started working on the book, and as we were thinking about we were talking about writing a book together and talking about what it would mean to write a race-conscious book, we thought a lot about what it meant to then try to write from an authentic experience of each of our own individual cultural experiences. And I want to explain to you why I think that's important before I explain why I think tradition's important. Because Jason and I, as probably many of you know, have had an amazing opportunity to travel around the country and talk to kids all across the country. We've talked to more than 50,000 young people around the country to tell them about our book, All American Boys, about two boys, one black, one white, both of whom go to the same high school, live in the same town, are going to the same Friday night party, stop at the same corner store on the way to that party. And at that corner store, Rashad Butler, the young black boy, is brutalized by a white police officer, and Quinn Collins, the young white boy, witnesses this event and knows the police officer. The police officer is a father figure for him. And the story is about how these two teens then process that experience afterwards and process it with their families and process it in their community and process it in their high school. Jason and I were thinking a lot about the speech that Martin Luther King Jr. gave at Grosse Pointe High School in 1968. We spoke about two Americas living side by side. And we thought about how All American Boys would talk about how that's so true today. Two Americas living side by side. We might, in fact, talk about the multiple Americas that are living side by side. But again, this comes from a place of love. To actually talk about the truth of what's happening in our lives is important, and it's really important for young folks because they're experiencing it. And to shelter them from it is our own problem of censorship because we're afraid of the world that we have failed to do better to shape. They're living in the world that we've failed to shape better. So they deserve our strength to give them the real stories of their lives. As Jason and I traveled around talking about All American Boys, I'll share this with you for one moment because sometimes people talk to me and say, hey, Brendan, it's really hard to hear you talk about white privilege so often. Oh my God. There are so many reasons that is demented. But one of the things that I think is really important for me to share with you all, and then I'm going to get into tradition, because I think this is the lead-in, is that in one conversation Jason and I were providing for a school, at the end of the presentation, as so often is the case, a number of the students of color come and speak to Jason, a number of the white students come speak to me. And at the end of this particular presentation, I was left alone in the room with a white supremacist. And I was having this conversation with the white supremacist as she was talking to me about how she didn't believe in white privilege. And I won't get into all the particulars because we don't have time for it today, but the first thing I was wondering, in fact, was what are the gun laws in this particular state? Because it's terrifying to think about that and to think about all the students of color who are in that community with a white supremacist who's out and feels emboldened enough to come speak to me afterwards. Brave enough, doesn't feel threatened in any way. And I thought about our conversation quite a bit, and I thought a lot about Brendan Kiely, white boy, and how easy it was for me to want to distance myself from her and say, well, I'm not that kind of white person. I wouldn't want to be that kind of white person. I would never want to be associated with that kind of white person. And she was doing the same thing to me. She didn't want to be associated with me. She wanted to distance herself from me. But if that white supremacist and I walk onto an elevator together, walk into a bank together, walk into a grocery store together, walk into any of these public spaces together, the experience that she and I have walking in side by side is so similar, whereas, and I know Jason doesn't mind if I share this, when Jason and I walk into a space together, when we walk into an elevator together, when we walk into a bank together, when we walk into a grocery store together, the experience that he and I are having are very different. That's white privilege. And to think about denying that is to be denying a truth of our cultural experience. To deny those truths and to tell kids that doesn't exist is a lie I will not participate in. I write for kids because I care about them. I love them. I was a teacher for many years. I miss it. I want to get back in the classroom because I feel like I miss my time with them because they're bold enough to ask the questions that sometimes us older folks are too afraid to ask. And I tell that story to you all about my time on the road with Jason because as I begin to think about tradition, and to tell you a little bit why I wanted to write tradition, I want you to hold that notion of privilege in your minds for a moment, because there's another privilege that I want to grapple with. I want to grapple with my white privilege every single day, because there's no point that I arrive at where I understand it. There's no point that I arrive at where I understand the impact of racism in America. It's more that I have to be committed, because I'm white, I have to be committed every day to try to do something to be anti-racist, to do something to address what it means to be a white person in America. Because the minute I don't do that, I'm succumbing to all that privilege and all that it offers and all the harm that it causes. I have to work against it. But likewise, I think about how I was taught to be a man. And I think about our world today, and I think about how often I've heard people say things like, when a young woman is maybe saying, I've had enough of these jokes in the hallway. I've heard people say, can't you just take a joke? I think about that because, again, as I think to my grandmother's line about a listening heart and what it means to have a listening heart, I think about how we as a society could do a better job listening to many of the folks in our society. I think about me as a man who could do a better job listening to the women in my life. As I listen to my wife tell me stories about how where we live in New York City, there's a lot of construction around where we live. If she walks 2 blocks this way, it's all new buildings going up. If she walks 2 blocks this way, it's all new buildings going up. And as she walks by, so often she gets the cat calls. As she walks by, so often she gets comments or whistles. Now, when I walk by, none of that happens, right? In fact, more often than not, the construction workers are looking down at their phones or whatever. Now, it's not just construction workers. That would be way too easy just to throw that out there and let that go. Because my grandmother, she too has a story she shared with me, one that I listened to. She talked about what it meant to join the workforce right as she graduated from high school. My grandmother was the valedictorian of her high school. It's amazing to me to think about this, from a small town in Pennsylvania. And when my grandmother got her first job after that, she worked at a doctor's office. In that doctor's office, there was a doctor who would take the youngest, newest female employee of that office with him to whatever conference he was going to, traveling away to some conference somewhere else in the country. And my grandmother told me the story because she said she felt very lucky that one of the other women in the office had shared that with her and said, if he invites you, don't go. If he invites you, don't go. That doctor, don't go with him. But think about all the women before my grandmother who hadn't been warned. And I think about that, listening to those stories, to those truths. When I sat down to write tradition, I began writing it in 2015. 2015, some of you may remember, Emma Salkowitz graduated from Columbia University. For those of you who don't remember who Emma Salkowitz was sexually assaulted on the campus of Columbia University. The university didn't want to talk about it. The university really didn't want to embrace the story in the way that she wanted them to embrace it, to recognize the harm, the truth of that experience. And so in an act of defiance and protest, she dragged her mattress around campus. Some of you may remember those images of this enormously courageous young woman dragging her mattress around campus. And in 2015, she dragged her mattress up onto the graduation stage. In an act of defiance, in an act to say, I will not be silenced, my story will not go unheard. That's tremendous strength and courage. And I also don't think that we should be burdening her with that need to have to do that, right? What if we were just better listeners? What if we embraced our listening hearts? I think about that because I think about how I was raised to be a man. I think about how when I was growing up and I was in high school, I had a guidance counselor at my high school, who came into class in 9th grade to say, hey, I'm going to teach you guys, because I went to an all-boys high school, I'm going to teach you guys how to be better scholars. I'm going to teach you how to be have better study habits. Let me tell you a little anecdote that I always share with the young men. Families would often invite me to come into their house and take a look at how their sons are studying or not studying, and I would give them tips. And so I went into this one house one day, and I went upstairs, and the kid's doing his homework in his bedroom, and I'm not going to go on to finish the story in his voice because I don't want to repeat the words. But the gist of it is this. He began to tell us how this student wasn't studying, but looking out the window and ogling the girls' cross-country team as they ran by in the street. But the man didn't just tell the story, he acted it out. He pantomimed what that experience might be. He caricatured the act of ogling. That guidance counselor of mine wasn't teaching me how to study, he was teaching me how to be a misogynist. He was teaching me how to objectify women. And I think about that because think about the forward trajectory of those kinds of cues, about how often young men are given these kinds of cues. When we talk about male privilege, when we talk about toxic masculinity, that's not a made-up thing. It's not a myth. The preponderance of those kinds of cues are devastating. They're devastating because the ultimate result can be harmful for young women and women of all ages, and they can also be harmful to young men because they rob all of these young men of the opportunity to become the full human that they can be. And I wanted to write about that. I wanted to write about the strong young women who are standing up to the misogyny of our world and the young men who maybe want to listen but haven't been told how to yet. They don't have the models to yet. I think about that teacher who taught me how to objectify women and ogle women because I think about that same high school when I was a senior. We were preparing for the senior prom, and the school allowed a tuxedo rental company to hang up posters around the school. And these posters were all the same image. It was 3 boys in tuxedos from the tuxedo rental company, and it was one young woman in a prom dress. And the 3 boys were around the young woman. The young woman was tipped upside down so that her head was on the ground and her legs were in the air. She was leaning against a surfboard, and 2 of the boys each had a hand around one of her ankles. I hope I don't have to explain the subtext of that message. But to a young man who's been taught over and over and over and over and over again how to ogle and objectify women, the message seems pretty clear that prom equals sex, and you're entitled to it. That kind of messaging, I think, is destructive. It's horrible, right? I'm not promoting this. I'm being honest, just like I am when I'm talking about what it means to have white privilege. Just like I am to say, look, when that white supremacist and I walk into an elevator together, we have a similar experience. We share a privilege. Well, likewise, guys, we have to think about and reflect on what our privileges are. We have to think about and reflect on how we have been too often taught to be misogynists and what effect that has in our culture. When I sat down to write Tradition, I wanted to write about those 2 voices, as I was saying before. Because if I'm going to write about love, right, I want to write about the love that it takes to have the courage to stand up and say something about it. As so many women have been saying for so long, I think about how we talk about the Me Too movement, and I'm very grateful that Tradition has been called a separate piece for the Me Too generation. I really appreciate that very much, but I can't stand up here and talk about that without thinking about the Me Too movement and how, while I was introduced to it originally because of Hollywood, in fact, Tarana Burke, a black woman from the Bronx, started Me Too more than a decade ago. And I think about how people have been talking about this, women have been talking about this for so long, and I want to honor the Emma Salkowitzes of the world. I want to honor the Tarana Burkes of the world by writing Jules Devereaux's half of this book. This is a book told in 2 voices, Jules Devereaux and James Baxter. And James Baxter is a boy. James Baxter, part of the inspiration for his story, that same year in 2015, as we moved into 2016, you may remember a presidential campaign. You may remember during that presidential campaign the Hollywood Access tapes. And you may remember that on those Hollywood Access tapes, we heard Donald Trump's disgustingly violent language, attitude, and behavior towards women exposed for us all to hear. No one can say it didn't happen. It happened. We heard it. We heard that, and there was a lot of chatter in the world of media about, oh, that's just locker room talk. Don't get overworked up about that. That's just, can't you take a joke, or it doesn't really mean anything. It doesn't have any effect. Well, look at the news this week. It has effects. And locker room talk is something that I was really accustomed to as a three-sport athlete growing up. I know about that locker room talk. But also, after I heard and saw that Hollywood Access tape, I saw a photo of a boys' football team in Portland, Oregon. This boys' football team all were wearing wild feminist t-shirts. And the caption below the photo was, "Not in our locker room, not in our locker room, not in our locker room," right? And so James Baxter, the other half of this book, I wrote James Baxter for all those boys out there who are saying not in our locker room. For all the boys who are willing to listen to those other boys and say not in our locker room. And to join all the women who've been saying enough is enough is enough. We can do better. And I believe books can help us get there. I believe in books because I'll share this one last anecdote and then I'll open up for a quick Q&A. When I was in 10th grade, I remember reading Frankenstein. I remember reading Frankenstein with Mr. Riley, one of my favorite teachers, because I remember a scene in the novel Frankenstein where Dr. Frankenstein's creation is running into a village, and the villagers are all screaming at the creation, screaming and saying, we don't, basically the subtext is, we don't know you. You scare us because we don't know you. You scare us because we don't know you. And they're yelling, phrases at him and whatnot and chasing him out of the village. And I will never forget reading that scene in class and looking up, terrified, at Mr. Riley. You're my Mr. Riley right now. Looking up at Mr. Riley and kind of mumbling to myself, but saying, when am I one of those villagers? When am I chasing someone away from the cafeteria table? When am I chasing someone out of the room? When am I not listening to people who are asking to be heard? I think books can change perspectives, can change lives. In that moment, I thought a lot more, though I didn't have the words for it at the time. I thought a lot more about how I wanted to work on my listening heart and not be one of those villagers chasing the creation out of the village. And so, because there's not a lot of time left, I do want to open it up for Q&A. And before I do, I just also want to say thank you to all of you for listening, because it takes listening in order for us to have a conversation. So if you want to now talk to me and I'll listen, I'll come to the signing line and I'll listen to you all you want. But we have about a little less than 10 minutes left, so let's open it up to Q&A if we can. But thank you very much. And it's hard for me to see, so if you get to a microphone, just start talking.
If you weren't an author, what would you do in your life?
Thanks! If I weren't an author, what would I do? So I'm really grateful to be an author, and in other talks I talk a lot more about the writing process, but given the space we're in, I wanted to make sure I said what I had to say. The truth is, I called my mother when after my first day of teaching, and I'd had many jobs before that, and I called my mother and I said, "Ma, I finally found a job I like." I love teaching, and if I'm not an author, or if I can find a way to go back into teaching with a more regular schedule, I'll go back to that. Because for me, teaching is a social experience in which I'm learning along with all the students, and I want to do that more. I want to do a lot less one person on a stage and a lot more group working together. So thank you.
Hi. Last time I saw you, you were wearing that T-shirt. And I thought, I like this
Wild
guy.
feminist?
Yes.
Nice.
And I feel like we're old friends now because I come talk to you after every lecture that I see. But I just wanted to share that when I teach in a middle school, and when my son was there, I said, you know, of all the places in the middle school don't ever want to be in the room is during FLE, which is what we call the sex ed.
Yeah.
In the boys, they split it, you know. And I said, I can just imagine what the room is like. And my son, he's a very sort of tender, kind person. And I said, all that innuendo and the jokes. And he said, yeah, it's worse when the teachers do it. And it just broke my heart. And I'm just so pleased that you've written this book. So I just want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
If you love teaching so much, what made you decide to become an author?
Well, that is a great question. When I went back to the school where I was a teacher, Jason and I went to do a presentation about All-American Boys there, and there was a student who stood up and said, "Come back!" And I was like, that was an awesome moment. I felt really, grateful, but it was hard to do at the time because of the demands of traveling around and talking about the books and whatnot. But the reason why I left is because I love books. I love teaching. I love Jason. I love traveling around with one of the closest friends of my life. I love that guy. But I also love my wife. And Jessie, my wife, is also an author, and she had an opportunity to go work for 1 year in Italy. And so she was going to go to Italy, and I was going to go with her. And so it meant I had to leave the classroom so I could go be with her. And that's how things got started, actually. So I'm going to find a way to try to bring it all together. But I went because I love my wife. Yes?
What do you like and what are the challenges of co-writing a book?
Nice! So what do I like? Aside from only having to write half a book, which is pretty cool. So to make a sports analogy, which I know is wild, but I still love sports. This is a book that has discussions about problems in some sports culture, but I love sports, and I'm not going to throw sports under the bus. When I played basketball, one of the best feelings in the world is on a fast break and being able to pass the ball, and you know that person's going to be there without even having to look. And while co-writing All-American Boys with Jason, we felt that experience, being able to pass the ball and knowing that other person's going to be there. That's a remarkable experience as an artist, because so much of your time is spent alone and in agony. And to have a friend to share that with is tremendous. And again, if we're going to talk about listening hearts, if you're going to be writing about stuff that's really important and really serious and really hard, it's pretty powerful to have someone that you love with whom to share that experience. So collaborating is amazing. Yeah.
With all your social changes, does it increase or decrease in your faith?
Wow. This is going to be the second last question, thankfully. I have a complicated relationship with faith. And it's much more than I can say in the 1 minute I have left. But I will say this, that I see no reason not to have faith in humanity. And there are many of us that find our faith in humanity through a faith in another higher power. And right now, I'm choosing to see the higher power that's within social groups who decide to work together and listen to each other and make the world a place that's more just and more equitable. That's where I have faith, but faith requires work. And so therefore, if I want to believe in and have faith in that community, I have to be an active participant in that community. I can't just want it to exist, I have to work for it. And so for me, any question of faith is a question of work, and I want to believe in that community, so I want to help be a part of it. So, thanks. Last question?
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you all for saving the best for last. But,
Yes! See, I have faith!
yeah, sorry, my heart's beating really fast. But Do you think it would impact a lot on the news if and help stop victim blaming while we watch the news, to stop using passive voice and instead using active voice? Like, for example, I remember once in All American Boys, it was like no, but like in any act of violence on the news, I mean, like for example, it was like I'm sorry, I'm really nervous.
No. Keep going. You're awesome. You're awesome.
It was like Rashad was beaten, but it's like, no, the cop beat Rashad.
Yes.
You know, and like, do you think it would help us a lot to like help stop victim blaming and instead like see the real picture and like be truthful, not neutral, like Amanpour's phrase?
So you're framing this as a question, but I hear it as a statement, and I agree with you.
Yeah.
I'm with you. No, I'm serious. I'm not saying this to be coy. I'm saying I think what you're saying is really important, right? So I'm backing you up on that.
Yeah.
Because absolutely, I agree with you. We have to be, accountability is in the active voice.
Yeah.
And if we want to work on that community, if we want to be active participants in that community, we have to be bold and speak in the active voice. And that's why I have to talk about the privilege that I have as a thing that is a part of my everyday experience, right? We have to speak in the active voice. That is so awesome that you brought that up. And what a great way to end. Let's go out there and read, be inspired, and then go do something about it all. Thank you.